on this day. Give us eyes to see your hand at work in even the hardest situations in the world, and give us the courage to stand as your people in the midst of conflict and strife. All this we ask in the name of Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Please be seated. Well, I was so tempted today to speak to you from this wonderful gospel where Jesus is an instrument of God's abundant love and deep desire to satisfy our hunger and to meet our needs. But just hearing of the feeding of thousands unfortunately threw me back to the place from which I have just recently returned, Jerusalem, and all the reports of the thousands there who have died or are injured, especially in Gaza. And so even in spite of this place that my mind won't let me let go of, I have not lost hope in the God of this morning's gospel, for I am just more deeply aware that we too, like Jesus, are called to be instruments of God's reconciling love among our fellow human beings. We too are called to feed the hungry, to protect the innocent, and yes, even to take stands that may sometimes be unpopular. And in that calling, we are not alone. For I was reminded last week, sitting in a cathedral, St. George's, in East Jerusalem, I was reminded by a Palestinian Christian, Episcopalian preacher, that Jesus was familiar with what it was to seek truth and to worship in the midst of occupation, that indeed he, as a good Jew, lived in occupied Palestine, that at that time was occupied by Rome, and that he knows what it is that we are up against when we hope to take a stand. So let me tell you a story. About 10 days ago, the road wherein we were living in East Jerusalem, which is a part of the West Bank, so Palestinian territory just outside Jerusalem, got closed early in the morning. And to my recollection, got closed a day early because we were there in Palestine and Jerusalem at the time of Ramadan. And typically in Ramadan, especially on the Fridays, which is the Muslim holy day, those Fridays, actually in their month, those 4 Fridays, the numbers of people who come into Jerusalem to make a pilgrimage and to worship at the Temple Mount increases. So that 2 years ago when we were there on the last Friday of Ramadan, in fact, there were 300 or 400,000 pilgrims coming to Muslim pilgrims coming to worship at the Temple Mount. And so we were surprised when on the Thursday before the last Friday, which is their big pilgrimage day, the road was closed. We went in and out, but they wouldn't let our taxi come in. And they were clearly, the Israeli police were blocking the road. So much to our surprise, we didn't see much activity. It meant that all the businesses from 3 blocks away and all the way down were not getting any customers at a time of year that would have been, the streets would have been overflowing. And on this high holy day, in the Muslim understanding of their pilgrimage and prayer, that Thursday night where the roads were closed, that Thursday night is the night when faithful Muslims understand that if they will go and pray on that mount, that in fact there will be this moment during the night when the heavens will open up and God will especially hear their prayer. But all of that was blocked. So we went down and we had dinner nearer the city in a restaurant that had a huge window that opened on the public bus terminal for the Palestinians, and a block from the old city that you could see lighted up. And we went near dusk, and on the way we heard the cannon boom, which is the signal to all of Jerusalem during Ramadan that the end of the feast day, the fast day, is over and they can feast. And so suddenly everyone went inside. They had not eaten since 5 o'clock in the morning, and literally the streets were empty as we began our meal at this restaurant. Not very long into it, a huge crowd of maybe 25 or so Israeli officers gathered. Nobody around, except I must say there were these public buses coming in from the hinterlands. And you would see older women particularly get off the bus. They would have, like an overnight bag because they were going, even though it was supposed to be shut down, they were finding a way to get into the temple to offer their prayers. And I imagined that they were there praying for the health and well-being of grandchildren, or for friends who were sick, or for someone who might be dying, but bringing their prayer request on that holy night. And suddenly that sort of peace and that simple silence was shattered with sounds of great boom. Air booms. Nobody dropped down. It didn't look like anybody was hurt. Then another boom, and tear gas went off. Then a whole host of Israeli soldiers in SWAT gear, astride horses, came galloping down these empty streets, and more booms were going off and more tear gas. Finally, a few, maybe 3 or 4, young Palestinians were running down the street. I had the idea, honestly, they just looked like they were like teenagers with nothing to do. And 20 Israelis started chasing them with guns, and right behind them were people that had just vacated our restaurant with iPads running down the street behind them trying to get this on film. It went on like that, booms. One literally as close to me as Francis as you are, right in front of me. But it didn't look like anybody died. They weren't shots. It was all some form of intimidation. And it went on for 2.5 or 3 hours. And so we couldn't go back and walk on the streets because we didn't know what we would encounter. And then right before we were getting ready to leave, a huge water cannon, I don't know how to describe it. It was like this tank with a water spout, started spraying this water all over. And the smell was like 4 years ago when we went to Haiti and there were decaying, dying bodies there. It was a combination of that and a sewage smell. And for those of you who are scientists, when Stephen and I left the restaurant, we could tell that they had also mixed it with a surfactant so that it was stuck on everything. So all the streets had been sprayed, and the smell was so overwhelming. And the entrances to the Palestinian businesses had been sprayed. Every car had been sprayed. People had been sprayed. Finally, about 11:30 at night, we thought it looked safe to walk home. Didn't see any sort of skirmishes. Thought it was safe to walk home. Had to walk through the smell. The smell lasted for an entire week afterwards. The smell is called skunk. When you look it up on the internet, it's apparently a non-lethal crowd-control device. It's designed to smell like raw sewage and all of those things, but in fact, they claim, and I looked up at the MSDS, which is the sort of data sheet on it, they claim that it's organic, it doesn't hurt anyone, but the experience we had was it can't be washed off very easily. Apparently it stays in clothes for up to 5 years. And it was really hard for people to wash. Palestinians were out trying to wash the walkways around their businesses and their cars. And that smell lasted for the whole rest of the time of our visit, for 10 more days. When you walked down those roads, you had to hold your nose. My son, Christian, was only 3 years old, and I took him to the local barber shop for the cheap cut, right? And so we were sitting there in this, waiting patiently on a Saturday morning when other little children were lined up. And the barber had a 2.5-year-old in the chair who was particularly squirmy. And the barber got pretty harsh with the child. May not have had any children of his own, but he was speaking harshly to this little boy. I was reading a magazine, waiting patiently for our turn, and my son Christian hopped up, walked over next to the barber, really little, 3 years old, skinny little kid, and said, "That's no way to treat a little boy." Even when we're 3 years old, we know when someone is being mistreated. So today I want to focus with you on the Old Testament lesson that Diane so wonderfully read. But before we get to that lesson, I want you to think about who is your biggest adversary. Now, before you go all pious on me and pretend you've never had an adversary because you live such a Christian and exemplary life, all of us have adversaries. It could be someone you've encountered in business or a college classmate with whom you've always had deep philosophical differences. Or maybe your biggest adversary is a sibling of yours with whom you argue over responsibility and authority in the family, or inheritance issues, or even about who is which parent's favorite. Maybe you've had secret adversarial feelings about someone just ahead of you on the promotion ladder at work, or perhaps the one who beat you to the prettiest girl at the dance so you never got to dance with her and she married somebody else. Or maybe you have some adversarial feelings about someone with whom you're in competition, who maybe have a better golf game, or may win more points in tennis, or win more races, or ride better than you do. Or maybe you grew up in a family where there really wasn't enough to go around, and you found yourself at odds with someone close to you because of the distribution of necessities of food, clothing, or shelter. Maybe your adversary used to be your friend, but pointed out to you the truth about your own ambition, or pointed out the emptiness of your pursuits, and you really do not like him or her for noticing your flaws. We all have had and do have adversaries, sometimes many. Some adversaries seem to go away. We either lose interest or we reconcile with them, or we reconcile with ourselves and they don't seem so bad. But as soon as that happens, some others replace them. Some of us just need an enemy or two, or a cause, to keep our energy up. But adversaries are a reality in our life. So think about that. Think about adversaries as we contemplate the story this morning that we hear about Jacob, but remembering a few things. Jacob was a twin like me, a fraternal twin, born second. So even in the womb, competing for nourishment from their mother. Birthright was bestowed on the oldest, and thus on his brother Esau. And then Esau was the inheritor of all of the authority in the family. And in the stories in Genesis, they portray Jacob as a trickster, as if even in the womb he was nipping at his brother's heels, You know, they tell the story that Esau was his father's favorite and Jacob was his mother's favorite, and that set up a whole dynamic in the family. And not surprisingly, they had different ways of going about life and things they liked to do. But Jacob was always on the lookout to gain advantage over his brother and to somehow gain the blessing that was his brother's birthright. One day his brother came in, famished from a day of hunting, and wanted to eat the food that Jacob had been preparing. And so Jacob said, "I'll trade you this food, how hungry you are, for your birthright." And jokingly, Esau said, "Oh, okay," and ate some food. But more telling was, near the end of their father's life, when their father was in ill health and could not see, Jacob tricked his father with the help of his mother. Just as an aside, Game of Thrones doesn't have anything on the Bible. So, with the help of his mother, tricked the father and went before him, pretending to be his brother, and got the blessing. And when his brother came home and discovered it, he was furious, asked the father, and the father said, "I can't bless both of you. I've already blessed your trickster brother." And so Jacob was known as a usurper, and Esau was furious, wanted to kill him, so his mother helped him plan an escape, and he went off to her brother's land far away until everything cooled down. Even in that land, he was a trickster and a negotiator. He was always trying to get his own way, but eventually, 20 years later, God called him to return to the land of his birth. And so, even knowing that his brother may still want to kill him, he took himself and his whole family and his entourage and wanted to go back home. And today's lesson is at the river Jabbok, where he's believing that he's about to encounter his brother. Now, mind you, he knows that he's in trouble because he has sent envoys ahead with all kinds of presents to try to soften up his brother. But essentially, he believes he's going to be killed. And Jacob, with all of his character flaws, is just like all of us. He's a faithful person that is praying to God to help him in this situation. In the story we heard today, Jacob wrestles with an unknown man that we come to know was God. The tradition in the Old Testament is that no one can see God face to face and live. And Jacob spent the night wrestling with God, not just seeing this person, but this angel or whomever it was that God became for him, but wrestling with God. And I would have to say wrestling with himself as well. And in the wrestling, instead of anyone dominating, although Jacob was winning until he got his hips pulled out of joint, but even rather than destroy him, they asked each other for a blessing because there was something about the struggle that they were having that initiated both respect and forgiveness. And so Jacob was blessed. His name was changed to Israel, and he became, the Israel with 12 tribes. And Esau, when they met, as they did, when he saw his brother approaching and bowing 7 times, finding the courage to try to enter into relationship, Esau raced up and hugged his brother. And after 20 years, although they had been adversaries, they found a way to achieve reconciliation by forgiveness. And the story says that instead of competing for the same land, they found lands near each other so they could both continue on their life and be blessed by God. 25 years ago, I spoke with an American Indian who was a Christian, but also had continued to practice some of his tribal ways. he described to this youth group that I brought before him what he understood to be their history. He said, we watched the violence, we watched our people get slaughtered, and we decided to take the arrow and not fight back. We did not want to do violence to the other the way it had been done to us. I don't think people are their governments. Our government, we hope, is a democracy and represents us. I don't think the state of Israel is commensurate to all the people who live there. I don't think we can inaccurately call Israel just a Jewish nation. There are, after all, about 15% of the people who live in Israel who are either Muslim or Christian. The Palestinians are not all Muslim. There is a significant Christian presence in Palestine. All the leaders of the Episcopal Church in Jerusalem, the bishop, the dean of the cathedral, all the priests are Palestinians. Many of them whose families have been Christians in that land back to the time of Jesus. I believe that they are all neighbors, that we are their neighbors as well. The Old Testament that the three great religions share, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, have this same story. Our Muslim brothers and sisters essentially believe that they are descended from Esau, as the Jews and then we are descended from Jacob. They are of the same DNA. They are brothers. So I wonder who is making all the decisions for the kind of destruction that I witnessed while over in what we call the Holy Land. And I was struck because daily I would read my New York Times online, and then later the Jerusalem Post, a particularly conservative, I think, Jewish newspaper in Israel. And both of those papers had this wonderful editorial, some of you may have read it, called Powerful and Cold-Hearted. And it's the story of some research that's been done, psychological research, studies, that look at how people with power understand the sort of common person's plight. And their conclusions after this study and written in this editorial were, we found that for those participants who were induced to experience feelings of power, given power over others, their brains showed no resonance with the actions of others. Conversely, for those participants in the study who were induced to experience feelings of powerlessness, their brains resonated quite a bit. In short, the conclusion was that the brains of powerful people did not really mirror or were not touched by the actions of other people. They kind of had a single-minded focus. And that they found that the more power that people expressed, the less their brains resonated with the realities on the ground. Power, they say, appeared to change how the brain itself responded to others. So the bad news in their study is that the powerful are, by default and at a neurological level, simply not motivated to care. But the good news is that they are, in theory, redeemable. Built into our DNA as human beings is this way, apparently, that when we have power, we're able to put the concerns of others at a distance. And I think we've watched that in the calamity in Gaza, where almost 2,000 people have been killed and 9,000 have been injured. Most 80% of those, older people, women, and children. And in Israel, because of our protection of them with the dome, and our providing them of the military hardware and the bullets and the missiles, as some are providing apparently to Hamas as well. But they've had far fewer deaths, and almost exclusively deaths of people who have chosen to fight in the Israeli Defense Force. What I want to say to us today, to you, and maybe as a preacher I'm always speaking to my own heart, the life of a Palestinian is no more or less valuable to God than the life of an Israeli. The death of an Israeli soldier is no more important to the God who loves us than the death of an innocent in Palestine. Returning to that conversation about adversaries, there is a way that we could be respecting the adversaries that we encounter without trying to kill them. There is a way that we could be blessing each other, acknowledging our strengths, and finding a way to live in peace. The roots of that kind of reconciliation are found in the scripture that is holy to all of us, and in this story of Jacob and Esau, where we are reminded that we are all brothers and sisters. Amen.